The golden rays of the setting sun stretched across the central park, casting everything in a warm orange glow. Laughter filled the air as families strolled together, and children played around the sparkling fountains. But amidst this vibrant scene, a tall, broad-shouldered man sat silently on an old wooden bench, his head bowed beneath a tattered hood. The frayed coat draped over his shoulders was like a veil, hiding everything about him. Beneath his worn-out shoes, his large feet rested quietly, as if burdened by the heavy steps of a lifetime. In his hand, a paper cup rattled faintly, the soft clinking of a few loose coins barely audible against the bustling background. He seemed like a shadow, forgotten by the world, with not a single glance cast his way. But few would have guessed that beneath the torn fabric sat Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend recognized by millions around the globe. At this moment, Shaq wasn't the dazzling star or the embodiment of strength he was known to be. He was a man who had chosen to step into the shadows, immersing himself in the lives society often overlooks. Why is it this way? Shaq asked himself. He had heard countless stories of injustice, prejudice, and the way the homeless were treated. He had seen the reports on the news, but he had never truly understood the depth of their pain. Is it because they have nothing that they are seen as invisible? His gaze subtly swept over the people around him. An elderly couple holding hands as they walked, a child chasing after a ball, a mother carrying her sleeping baby. They all passed by him without a second thought. Each time, Shaq felt a quiet ache in his heart, a heavy sense of rejection that grew with every indifferent glance. Lowering his head further, he pulled his shoulders inward against the chilly wind. But inside, his determination burned brightly. Today I will become a nobody. Today I will listen to what this world says to those who have nothing to lose. Amidst the fading twilight, a question began to form in the minds of those observing this scene. How would Shaq be treated? Would those who claimed to uphold justice see the human heart beneath the ragged clothes, or just the tatters? A gentle breeze passed by, carrying the aroma of street food and the echoes of cheerful laughter. Shaq remained motionless, as if he had belonged to this forgotten corner for a long time. His eyes closed briefly, but his mind stayed sharp, observing everything. Bright sneakers flashed past him, and carts filled with ice cream and cotton candy rolled by at a slow pace. Everyone was preoccupied with their own stories, not sparing a thought for the quiet man seated on the bench. I've lived under the bright lights of fame, surrounded by admiration and love from millions. But today, I step into another world, one without attention, without respect, only indifference, Shaq thought, a mix of unfamiliarity and firm resolve rising within him. He recalled that morning, preparing himself for this experiment, the old, worn-out coat with intentional tears to make it look authentic, his gleaming athletic shoes replaced with a pair of ragged ones discarded by a friend. A shabby hood concealed his familiar features. He even took time to smudge his hands with dirt, ensuring every detail painted a convincing picture of a homeless man. Everything is ready, but is my heart prepared? Shaq wondered as he looked at himself in the mirror that morning. His chest felt heavy as he thought about the heartbreaking stories he'd heard. Cold, indifferent stares, cutting words, and the cruel oblivion endured by the homeless. Am I truly ready to experience this myself? But he knew one thing. To change anything, he first had to understand the pain, and today he would seek that understanding for himself. Walking into the park, Shaq chose a bench near the fountain, an area bustling with passers-by. He sat down, bowed his head, and gripped the paper cup tightly in his hands, occasionally giving it a small shake to produce the faint clinking of a few loose coins. The metallic sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but just loud enough to stir a vague pang of sorrow in anyone who might notice. Do they hear a cry for help in these coins? Shaq wondered, his quiet eyes tracing the steady footsteps of those who passed him by. Or is it just a familiar sound they've learned to ignore? A few people stopped briefly. A middle-aged woman dropped a coin into his cup, her eyes carrying a hint of sympathy, though she said nothing. A young boy tugged at his mother's hand, curiosity in his gaze as he looked at Shaq. But his mother quickly pulled him along. And then, most continued walking, as if Shaq was nothing more than another invisible part of the scenery. Shaq nodded gently each time someone paused, a quiet gratitude rising within him. Yet with it came a sharp sting in his chest. He realized that not everyone was indifferent, but the small gestures of kindness were far too few to change the harsh reality. This realization only strengthened his resolve. I need to know, will those tasked with protecting justice see the person behind these tattered clothes? In the distance, the sound of a police siren echoed faintly, like a reminder that his experiment was about to begin. Shaq took a deep breath, a mix of anxiety and determination swelling in his chest. This isn't just my test, he reminded himself. This is the story of millions of people like me today. From across the park, a black and white patrol car came into view. 2 officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the park like hunters searching for their target. Shaq stayed still, bowing his head lower, though his heart began to pound faster. Their footsteps grew closer, each one feeling like a countdown to the tense moment that was about to unfold. The larger question echoed in his mind. What will they see when they look at me? A person or just a problem to solve? The steady thud of their boots on the grass drew nearer, each step tightening the knot in Shaq's chest. He kept his head down, his hand slightly tightening its grip on the paper cup. His heart raced, part nervousness, part anticipation. Even without looking up, he felt the cold air shift as their shadows fell over his feet. This is it, Shaq thought, keeping his face calm and impassive. This is when the test truly begins. The 2 officers stopped directly in front of him. The first, a tall man with an imposing demeanor, scanned Shaq with a sharp, almost icy gaze. This was Officer Davis, who made no effort to conceal his suspicion. The other officer, Lopez, was smaller in stature, her eyes gentler, as if she was trying to assess the situation rather than jumping to conclusions. You can't sleep here, Davis said firmly, his voice devoid of any empathy. The park closes in an hour. Shaq looked up, his eyes weary, his voice low and raspy. I'm not sleeping, just resting for a bit. He spoke with a deliberate frailty, as though each word carried the weight of exhaustion. Lopez frowned slightly, stepping closer, her tone noticeably softer. Do you have any identification, or anywhere to go tonight? Her question wasn't accusatory. It carried a sense of concern, as if she genuinely wanted to help, rather than make things difficult. Shaq slowly shook his head, his voice steady, as though he was accustomed to not being welcomed. Nowhere yet. Just stopping here for a while. Davis, standing nearby, clearly wasn't satisfied. Crossing his arms, his cold eyes swept over Shaq, from the frayed jacket to the worn-out shoes. We've had complaints about people like you, Davis said, his tone dripping with judgment. Folks don't feel comfortable seeing vagrants hanging around here. You should move along. Those words cut through the air like a sharp blade, cold and filled with prejudice. Shaq felt a flicker of anger rise within him, but he suppressed it. This wasn't the time to react. It was a time to observe. Suddenly a voice rang out from a distance. He's not bothering anyone! An older woman standing nearby stepped forward with a look of indignation. He's just sitting here, not causing any trouble. Davis turned to her, his expression betraying his irritation. Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but please let us do our job. The woman hesitated, her eyes briefly reflecting a sense of hurt at being dismissed. She glanced at Shaq once more, as if she wanted to say something, but eventually, she walked away, silently. In her gaze, Shaq caught a faint glimmer of empathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by Davis's rigid demeanor. Lopez let out a soft sigh and turned back to Shaq. Would you like me to help connect you to a homeless support center? They might have a shelter or a meal for you. Shaq nodded slightly, maintaining an air of gratitude. Thank you. I'd appreciate any information you could provide. But Davis, unwilling to let the interaction end so easily, stepped closer. Hand over your ID, he demanded, his voice brimming with suspicion. We need to check your information. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn ID card, carefully prepared for this experiment. Handing it to Davis, he kept his expression fatigued yet composed. Davis took the card, scrutinizing it closely, his narrowed eyes filled with skepticism. Henry, huh? This ID looks pretty old. How long have you been here? Shaq responded briefly. Used to live here, but things got hard. Lopez glanced at her colleague, her discomfort with Davis's attitude evident. Instead of confronting him, she turned back to Shaq, her voice carrying a tone of reassurance. We're just doing a routine check. Don't worry. Inside Shaq, conflicting emotions swirled, a sense of relief at Lopez's attempts to help, but also deep frustration at Davis's unreasonable demands. Davis stepped back, opened the laptop in the patrol car, and began checking the ID. The tension between them grew heavy, as though every passing second dragged on endlessly. Shaq sat still, his hand gripping the paper cup tightly, his heart pounding as he waited to see what would happen next. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated Davis's tense face. Each keystroke felt like the beat of a drum, heightening the suspense in the chilly air. Lopez stood beside Shaq, her eyes shifting between her colleague and the homeless man in front of her, the conflict in her heart evident. Shaq remained silent, but within him, a storm brewed. He felt the injustice embedded in Davis's every glance and word, but he also saw a glimmer of hope in Lopez, a faint light amidst a dark, clouded sky. Nothing, Davis muttered as the system returned the results. He's clean. No warrants. No issues. His words were filled with irritation, as though finding no fault with Shaq only deepened his frustration. Lopez exhaled in relief, a faint smile crossing her lips as she turned to Shaq. There's no problem. You don't need to worry. But Davis wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped forward, leaning down to meet Shaq's gaze, his voice colder than ever. Listen, you might not be breaking the law, but your presence here is causing discomfort for others. People don't want to see someone like you sitting around. Shaq looked up, his gaze heavy, burdened with the pain of millions ignored by society. His voice, low and hoarse, carried the weight of his response. I'm just sitting here, not bothering anyone. Not bothering anyone? Davis raised an eyebrow, his tone suppressing barely contained anger. Families, kids walk by here. Do you think they feel comfortable seeing you sprawled out like this? If you don't leave, we'll have to take action. Lopez stepped in, placing a gentle hand on Davis's arm. There's no law against him sitting here, Davis. We can't force him to leave if he's not doing anything wrong. Her voice was soft but firm, as though trying to pull her colleague back from the edge of his prejudice. Shaq looked at her, a fleeting expression of gratitude flickering in his eyes, though he remained silent. He knew that any word from him now could be seen as defiance. Davis turned to Lopez, his frustration evident in his expression. So what do we do? Just stand here and let him sit? People have complained. Let me talk to him a little more, Lopez replied, her tone gentle but unyielding. She crouched slightly to meet Shaq at eye level. I know you're going through a hard time, but if you want, I can help you find somewhere safer to stay tonight. It won't be good for you to be here after the park closes. Shaq gave a faint smile, one tinged with sadness, but genuine. Thank you. But sometimes, just sitting quietly here, that's its own kind of peace. Davis, unsatisfied with the delay, stepped closer. Don't be defiant, he growled, his hand moving subtly toward the baton on his belt. If you don't leave, I'll have to take stronger measures. Shaq sat up straight, his eyes suddenly changing. shifting from exhaustion to determination. He looked directly at Davis, his voice calm yet weighted with meaning. Stronger measures? For sitting on a bench and doing nothing? The air between them seemed to freeze, each passing second heavy with tension. Shaq could sense Lopez's unease as she stepped forward, positioning herself between the two men. Davis, stop. We don't have the right to force him to leave. Davis hesitated, his gaze flickering between Lopez and Shaq, as though searching for a justification for his actions. Finally, he lowered his hand, though his voice remained filled with resentment. Fine, but if anything happens, you're the one responsible. Shaq stood up slowly, his towering frame causing Davis to instinctively take a step back. In that moment, the stark contrast between physical power and legal authority had never been clearer. But Shaq didn't do anything more. He simply slung the tattered bag over his shoulder and spoke in a deep, steady voice. I'll leave. Thank you for listening. Lopez nodded, a faint look of regret crossing her face. Take care. If you need help, come find us. Shaq walked away, his large figure heavy with unspoken weight. Behind him, Davis remained rooted to the spot, his cold gaze following Shaq's retreat. Shaq didn't look back, but he knew this moment had shifted something, not just within himself, but in the minds of those who stood there. Night fell, and the lights from towering buildings shimmered on the wet streets. Shaq returned to the small room he had secretly rented for this experiment. He sat down on the worn wooden chair, removed his disguise, and stared at the small camera carefully hidden beneath the layers of his tattered coat. I've seen enough, he thought, his eyes contemplative, a mix of disappointment and faint hope weighing heavily on him. Shaq knew that what he was about to do might spark controversy, but he also understood that sometimes, to create change, one had to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He turned on the camera and reviewed the footage, Davis's suspicious gaze, his cold words demanding Shaq leave, and Lopez's gentle yet ultimately constrained efforts to help. Each frame felt like a deep cut to Shaq's heart, evoking a powerful empathy for those forced to live under such prejudiced scrutiny. Shaq let out a heavy sigh before uploading the video to his social media account. He captioned it with a short yet impactful statement. How we see a person isn't about what they wear. It's about the compassion in our hearts. An experiment, with results worth reflecting on. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire. The first comments began to roll in, a mixture of shock, outrage, and admiration. Unbelievable! That's Big Shaq. How could anyone treat someone like this? Davis is a textbook example of prejudice, but props to Lopez for trying. This experiment is so necessary. It shows the real problem with how we treat vulnerable people. Shaq read the comments, his heart heavy but also relieved. People are starting to talk about this, he thought, a faint glimmer of hope shining through. This is the first step. Shaq read through each comment, his heart heavy yet feeling a sense of relief. People are starting to talk about this, he thought, a glimmer of hope shining in his eyes. This is the first step. The next day, major news outlets began reporting on the video. They replayed the scene of Davis threatening Shaq, contrasting sharply with Lopez's compassionate approach. The stark difference in how the two officers handled the situation struck a chord with viewers across the nation. A reporter remarked, "This isn't just the story of one individual. It's a microcosm of how our society perceives and treats the most vulnerable among us." The police department where Davis and Lopez worked couldn't ignore the growing public pressure. A press conference was quickly organized, during which a department representative stated, "We are committed to thoroughly investigating this incident. Additionally, we will implement further training for our officers to ensure that every individual is treated with respect and dignity." Davis was temporarily suspended and required to attend mandatory empathy training, while Lopez received commendation from her superiors for how she handled the situation. Despite the praise, Lopez couldn't shake her lingering doubts. I tried, she thought, but was it enough to make a difference? In an interview, Shaq shared his perspective. I didn't do this to get anyone fired. I just want us to reevaluate how we treat one another. The homeless aren't just people without homes. They're humans, with stories and pain of their own. In a quiet corner of the police station, Officer Davis sat silently, clutching a notebook during a training session on empathy and interacting with the homeless. The videos and stories he was required to watch felt like sharp knives cutting into his ego. Why did I act that way that day? Davis wondered, regret slowly taking root within him. One afternoon, Davis returned to the park during a patrol. This time, his gaze wasn't as cold as before. Instead, it held a trace of hesitation. He walked slowly past the benches, spotting a disheveled man sitting quietly. Davis stopped, took a deep breath, and approached. Hey there, everything okay? If you need help, I can provide information about shelters or other support, Davis said, his tone softer than usual. The man looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes, followed by gratitude. Davis didn't say anything more. He simply nodded and walked away. But inside, he felt a sense of relief. Maybe this is how I start to make things right, he thought. Another afternoon, at the same park where it all happened, Shaq appeared once more. This time, he wasn't in disguise. Towering above the crowd with his friendly demeanor, he instantly drew attention. People cheered, pens and notepads flashed, but Shaq smiled warmly, signing autographs and chatting as though he truly belonged there. Among those who approached, Officer Lopez stepped forward. Shaq, she said hesitantly, her eyes filled with remorse. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I tried to do the right thing that day, but I feel like it wasn't enough to change the situation. Shaq listened intently, his eyes reflecting deep respect. He replied in a warm, steady voice. You did great. You listened, and that's not easy to do. But next time, I believe you'll be able to do even more. They shook hands, a slow, deliberate gesture, yet one filled with meaning. Thank you for your compassion, Shaq said, his voice trembling slightly, as if every emotion he had suppressed was now pouring out through his words. It wasn't just the police department. The entire city began to change after Shaq's story. Programs supporting the homeless received more funding, and community discussions became a regular occurrence, focusing on understanding and helping those in need. A group of young people, inspired by Shaq's story, launched a campaign called See Them. They shared stories of homeless individuals, not as faceless statistics, but as people with hopes and struggles. We want people to realize they're not just nameless figures on the streets, one group member said. They're parents, children, and people fighting to survive. In a televised interview, Shaq sat across from the host, his eyes glimmering with hope. When asked what message he wanted to convey through his story, Shaq paused for a moment before answering. I don't expect to change the entire world with just one action. But if we can get one person to rethink, to stop and see a homeless individual as a human being, then I believe I've succeeded. No one should be defined solely by their appearance or their temporary circumstances. That's not all there is to them. He continued, his voice growing warm and profound. Change doesn't come from judgment. It comes from compassion, from choosing to listen instead of ignoring. And I hope that when people hear this story, they'll choose to listen. The story concluded with Shaq returning to the park, not in disguise this time, but as himself, a man who had sparked change. He looked around and saw a family smiling, a group of children playing near the fountain. But then his eyes caught an older man sitting alone on a bench, his gaze heavy with sorrow. Shaq walked over, sat down next to the man, and asked, Hello, sir. Is there anything I can do to help? That's how change begins, with one small but meaningful act, rippling outward like waves on a calm lake. Today's story isn't just about Shaq, Davis, or Lopez. It's about all of us, about how we choose to see and treat those who are vulnerable in our society. Sometimes, just a little empathy, a moment to listen, can change someone's entire world. The homeless are not just silent faces on the street. They're parents, children, people who once had dreams, people who still hold on to hope. They don't need pity. They need to be seen as human beings, to be offered a helping hand, to be met with understanding eyes. If this story has touched your heart, please share it. Help spread the message that everyone deserves to be treated with compassion. And if you can, start with something small. A smile, a kind word, or simply a glance filled with understanding. Don't forget to hit subscribe to join us on this journey of sharing stories that move hearts and change perspectives. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, big changes always start with small actions. And sometimes, just by listening, you're already making a difference.